It's so nice to be here. Hello, everyone. Oh, I should stay here. I'll stay here because of this space. Hello. Yeah, thanks, Celia. Thanks to everyone for such a really lovely welcome here. Um, this is like the center of psychedelic research in the world or the cosmos or the UK. It's amazing watching it happen from afar, you know, and so many awesome like researchers coming together and so on. So yeah, and I know some of you from like different places, and so I've been watching the assembling. There's probably some like my kids probably watch a program that involves a metaphor for like the assembling of something, the creature. But yeah, here you all are. So yeah, awesome. I'm usually based Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is far away, but really cool stuff is kind of happening there. And I thought I would start by just telling you a little bit about a project that we're running, because it's really kind of trying to be quite interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And it's a very participatory project with local communities. So this is kind of the main thing that I do at the moment. It's called Community Strategizing about Psychedelic Therapy in Aotearoa. And it's an 18-month philanthropically funded project to ask the question, what could and should psychedelic therapy in Aotearoa look like? So it's this kind of really awesome opportunity. The Australians did some legalizing minimally last year, and the relationship of the two countries is such that New Zealand may follow suit. So getting ahead of like any political changes or political desires and trying to do a grassroots connecting, building, knitting together project that engages like key stakeholders in the sort of psychedelic ecosystem is a real like privilege and honor. So I run it with Jorel McQueen here, and Davina Thompson was a project partner, and she passed away really sadly from cancer a couple of months ago. And so part of what Jorel and I are doing is kind of honoring her legacy and how we continue with the project. It involves doing a lot of meetings up and down the country, collecting data from key stakeholders who are like Indigenous healthcare practitioners, seers of the realms that some of us need psychedelics to be able to see, harm reduction practitioners, psychedelic practitioners, underground and overground, and people with lived experience of the mental health care system. Those are the kind of key stakeholder groups, but it's sort of wider than that. And yeah, we run meetings. We provide people with research if they're interested in that. We're doing a survey, and then the thing that we're really focused on right now is a meeting in March. At the end of March, it's a 2-day meeting. It's in Auckland. Shout out to the Aucklanders in the room. Yeah, and it's a 2-day meeting, and it's focused around, the way we've done it is it's focused around 5 breakout rooms, and each breakout room will discuss a different kind of topic that is kind of thorny and complicated around psychedelic medicalization and wider availability. So it might be like around harm reduction, both within and outside of the medical system, or about a pathway to reform, or about trial designs, and more broadly, like the knowledge that we need to learn over the next few years to kind of stay up with kind of medicalization and wider availability. And then the rest of the gathering is programming of keynotes and of panels that can then support those breakout room conversations. So the whole conference is kind of oriented around these breakout room conversations, these 5 topics that will have that will open. The rooms will open 3 times during the 2 days. So people get 3 opportunities to move between these rooms, to think together, maybe a bit divergently, and come up with like a brainstorming amongst kind of stakeholders in the country that will then take forwards for the next 4 months to the end of the project lifespan, and sort of iterate into the final recommendations for government, for community groups or whatever. So that's the sort of idea right now. And why I say a lot about that is because this feels like it's a timely moment there, but more generally, globally, it feels like these kinds of initiatives, they seem, maybe it's just because of where I'm sitting, but really important. But how to do good participatory engagement is hard, you know, I think, and it takes time, and it's like a lot of relationship building and so on. So if you know of other projects elsewhere, or you're involved in such kind of projects, trying to get ahead of like when, you know, politicians are suddenly like, yes, we want this, and then it kind of can be done badly. I mean, that's one way in which it may unfold. Then that could be something lovely for us to chat about afterwards in the Q&A or in the discussion after this. So yeah, and we definitely want to kind of learn about what's happening elsewhere in the world. And so yeah, so that's about this project. But what we're here to talk about. Is it sound? Should I mute this? You can hear me. Oh yeah. I thought I was effortlessly projecting. Is that good? Well, I mean, is that distracting? Is it from here? Okay, sounds cool. Bit of reverb. Yeah. Okay. Right. So this is actually a draft of a paper that's been a long time in the making, and yeah, I can see Patricia is on the call, and Patricia's read a draft several years ago, I think, but it's kind of trying to like rework it now. So it's on psychedelic liberalism and mad trust towards varieties of willing in extreme states. So it's trying to connect kind of the psychedelic and mad or psychotic kind of spaces and discourses. And I kind of gave a version of this talk just recently at a Mad Pride conference in Belgium, in Ghent. And so it's lovely to bring it to a kind of more psychedelic oriented audience, but and more magic and more. Yeah. So okay. So I've been interested in comparing psychedelic and mad or psychotic experiences for a while. And when you try and do that, you immediately run into difficulties. You could ask, what is the kernel? What is the kernel of the experiences that are used? Oh, it is me. It is me. Okay. Should I just push on through? It's a bit distracting. Well, it might be coming from here. I do. Should we bear the echo? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I don't mind. Yeah. Okay, so you can immediately like wonder like what is going on, and then you're like, and then you're in the space. But if you try and think about what the kernel is of the experiences that are produced through substances like LSD or psilocybin-containing mushrooms, you're going to into a lot of difficulty, right? Because it's so heterogeneous. And you can also ask, like, what's at the core of madness? And there's not only a lot of heterogeneity in the experiences, but there's a lot of contestation of what comes under those labels, or even the appropriateness of the labels themselves, right? It's very like conflicted kind of territory. So here are some examples that I organized into these kind of families of labels for describing the psychedelic experience that I think all of this could apply and sort of play out in relation to thinking about madness and psychosis and the discourses surrounding it. So the idea that I want to share today, I want us to sort of start to kind of think about a little bit, is how we have a kind of opportunity right now with a kind of psychedelic mainstreaming moment to enrich our understandings of psychedelic experiences and psychedelic therapy with resources and nuances that we find in the phenomenological study of madness. And I want to focus on the will, because as I said, psychedelic experiences are super variable, and one way in which their scientific study has sought to stabilize them has been to lay them side by side with understandings of psychosis or madness. And that's been called the psychotomimetic paradigm of psychedelics, that they mimic psychoses. And this way of thinking was pushed to the sidelines historically as disanalogies between psychedelic and psychotic experiences were foregrounded, partly as a reaction to the anti-psychiatry of the 1960s. So during the 1960s, there were popular understandings of schizophrenia, which some have called, Angela Woods has called the sublime object of psychiatry's fascination. And those would soon be reshaped although soon reshaped kind of how psychiatry understood psychosis and schizophrenia as anti-psychiatry movements kind of gained popular appeal in Europe and North America in the course of the 1960s. R.D. Laing, his hugely influential book, The Politics of Experience, which conceived madness as the potentially redemptive journey, was published in 1967. And in their influential, or in their 1969 review of this influential book, The Politics of Experience, for the British Journal of Psychiatry, Humphrey Osmond, with Harriet Mann and lead author Miriam Siegler, articulated a kind of definitive break between psychedelic experiences and the kinds of mad experiences that were being articulated through a Langian anti-psychiatry. And it's worth noting that Humphrey Osmond, for those of you who might not be familiar, he coined the term psychedelic as mind manifesting in 1956 to get away, or at least partly to get away from connotations of the dominant term that was used until then in research, which was psychotomimetic. So in their kind of excoriating review culminates in this way. Perhaps the most important point to be made about Lang's psychedelic model is its implication that schizophrenics will benefit from being seen as persons embarked on a voyage of self-discovery. It would be closer to the truth to see most of them as voyagers who have been shanghaied for unknown reasons onto a ship which never reaches port. Psychedelic voyages are usually voluntary, and the person usually knows what the agent of his changed perception is. Schizophrenia is involuntary. The person rarely knows the cause of his strange new perceptions, and he is unlikely to receive much helpful information about it. So key to the claim that psychedelic and mad experiences are dissimilar was the idea that the former are by and large willed, intentional, and consented to experiences of clear origin, while the latter assail the self, unexpected, unwilled, unwanted, and unexplained. So I've just been learning from the historian of psychedelics, Erica Dick, who is a kind of very good, established Canadian historian of psychedelics, that Humphrey Osmond had quite a complex understanding of psychosis and schizophrenia, as the term was more commonly used then. And I don't mean to paint him as like a villain or anything, but the quote is useful to articulating this kind of way in which these sets of experiences were held apart. And I think it sort of repeats in their ongoing histories after this point. So the stakes in the distinction between willed psychedelic experiences and unwilled psychosis are high for the sanitizing of the psychedelic experience in the service of medicalization. And there are significant implications for either side of the psychedelic psychotic distinction, because the other to the willed psychedelic experience is the unwilled psychedelic experience, which points at forced drugging and non-consensual psychedelic use that haunts both past and present psychedelic use in like the kind of global north and particularly in the places where it's being medicalized now. And the other to unwilled madness is willed madness, which marks a kind of limit for psychiatry, anosognosia, or a supposed lack of insight into one's own psychosis, and the risks of treatment non-compliance and the often violent reaction to treatment non-compliance that are often associated with it. So fast forward to today's resurgence of psychedelic therapy, and we can ask the question, how is the will of participants and patients being shaped through psychedelic clinical therapeutic modalities? And what I want to kind of explore is how centrally it's been through cultivating a trusting, curious, open mindset amongst participants in clinical research trials. And I would say kind of taking such approaches to their limits. So in this seminal, you probably all know this article on safety protocols and the current sort of wave of psychedelic research trials that was published in 2008 by key members of the Johns Hopkins research team. They write, the volunteer is encouraged to mentally surrender to the experience, trusting that her or his usual state of consciousness will return when the drug effects resolve. For example, if the participant experiences disturbing internal imagery of a demon or monster, he or she is encouraged to mentally approach the figure and interact with it, e.g. imagine asking the figure why it has appeared, rather than attempt to flee from the disturbing imagery. The participants should be alerted that sometimes people experience extremely convincing sensations of dissolving, melting, exploding, and so forth, and that the best way to deal with all such situations is to surrender to the experience, subjectively allowing oneself to dissolve, melt, or explode. And then similar advice on kind of more somatic level. Then if we fast forward 7 years, and we find this elaboration in Johns Hopkins' lead therapist or guide, Bill Richards' seminal book. He says, in the Middle Ages, monks may have learned to deal with demons by looking them straight in the eye and holding an elevated cross between themselves and their visions. Similarly, should one encounter a visionary demon, dragon, monster, or bogeyman, one, if well prepared, will steadily and intentionally move towards the manifestation with eye contact if possible, essentially saying, hello, are you ever scary? Why are you here? What are you made of? What might I learn from you? And then sort of fast forward, a sort of symbolic manifestation of something becomes apparent. And what is so important here is the discovery that the monster has meaning and in itself is an invitation to enhance psychological health and spiritual maturation. Its purpose is not to torment, but to teach. That bears repeating. Its purpose is not to torment, but to teach. And then meanwhile, over at Imperial College London, there was the development of the accept, connect, embody model. So this published in 2020, and they write, and here's the kind of diving down, this may be familiar for the pearl and then coming up. They write, imagine you're diving down the warm water, you're completely safe as you dive down, the water surrounds you and holds you. Currents pull you in this way and that way, you just trust and let go and you swim deeper down. You're on a journey and you're carried by the currents. You don't have to decide where to go. Just let yourself be carried. With each moment, you surrender yourself more and more. You let go and allow yourself to glide along wherever this journey will take you, down, up, down, sometimes smooth, sometimes turbulent, but always knowing that you're safe. All you need to do is trust, let go, and be open to these waters. See what you might find. So I think it's the renowned kind of underground Canadian psychedelic therapist, Andrew Feldmar, who was actually taught and supervised in LSD therapy by Lang in London in the 1970s, who best kind of articulates what I'm kind of interested in here. He suggests that we should embrace Marion Milner, the psychoanalyst Marion Milner's dictum. The only proper function of the will is to will not to will. Visualize the will as a snake and make it bite its own tail. So this is the kind of paradox or the pseudo paradox that I want to unpack a bit more in the rest of this talk. It's not, and it's also not just during the time that someone's under the influence of the psychedelic, whether that's like 3 to 5 hours or 8 to 10 hours or what have you. It's also during the kind of preparatory phases as well, where we're sort of seeing this kind of ethos. So Jules Evans is a kind of journalist and a researcher in the psychedelic space. He writes about companies that are now offering, quote, virtual reality experiences to train people in the surrender response, which can help them to prepare for a psychedelic experience. And then, of course, there's afterwards, it's kind of part of the integration, which is kind of understood as taking the fruits of the psychedelic experience forward into everyday life. And people may tie that integration period to kind of these periods of neuroplasticity post-psychedelic use that last maybe several weeks, or people might sort of talk about integration as lasting months, years, or even a lifetime. But so it's a more generalized approach to this kind of ethos of trusting, being open, and willed surrender that I think extends beyond just the acute kind of period of the psychedelics, of the psychedelic experience. The idea of willful surrender might be therapeutically safe if we assume that the mind is contained and protected. And this is how it is often conceived through psychedelic science and medicalized therapeutics. So Roland Griffiths, who I had the pleasure of working with under for a couple of years when I kind of got into this research, he says here, the late Roland Griffiths, who died last year, I think, he said, preparation for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is incredibly important, and we do a good bit of preparation. And from where I sit, preparation in terms of mindfulness, even mindfulness meditation, recognizing that your mind is capable of constructing all kinds of things, and there's nothing in mind that can harm you. So that's meant to guarantee that modes of willing in the psychedelic experience will not go awry. And there is something courageous and bold in the claim that nothing in mind can harm us. It enables this clear therapeutic programmatic to enter into and stay with whatever comes up, as well as this idea that one may encounter not what one wants to hear, but what one needs to hear. At the same time, that kind of demarcation of the mind from the world, where clearly much can and does harm us, leaves itself open to claims of, for example, the porosity of the mind, the entanglement of mind and world, the world as collective mind, or even how the overwhelming forces of the world are mirrored by overwhelming forces in the mind. So in the case of Bill Richard's demons, they might be characterized for therapeutic purposes as metaphorical, but this leaves open the question of whether there do exist forces that are capable of overwhelming human minds, whether from within or without. And in existing psychedelic discourses, there are resources and counterpoints which we might bring to bear here, describing malevolent spirits and sorcery in indigenous and animist traditions, archons in Gnostic Christianity. It's something that Eric Davis has written a bit about. And of course, the role of the unconscious in psychodynamic frameworks. And it's here that I think we can also learn a lot from madness. So MAD movements, they include a variety of ways of managing and cultivating extreme experiences through curiosity, trust, openness, and more: acceptance, compassion, observation, attention, and participation into a bigger union. But journeys through madness also reveal how willing extreme experiences can offer threads that dangle like lures into new vistas and openings beyond the safe shores of madness's mere observers. In his influential 1992 book, Madness and Modernism, the phenomenological psychiatrist Louis Sass characterizes schizophrenic experience as an excess of self-awareness and reflexivity, what Sass calls hyper-reflexivity. So in contrast to a kind of more regressive model of madness, this is kind of about spirals of awareness that alienate the person from their body and emotions in ways that he argues are uncannily reminiscent of modernist art. We might say that Sass's pathogenetic model of schizophrenia is psychedelic insofar as the experience reifies and makes available for reasoning and reflection an amplification of whatever was already there. It's kind of like this Groffian kind of non-specific amplification kind of idea. One point which Sass has returned to many times in and since Madness and Modernism is whether madness ought to be considered willed or unwilled, in his terms an act or an affliction. And he insists that in reality it's ambiguous. He suggests schizophrenic symptoms, quote, occupy an anxious twilight zone somewhere between an act and an affliction. As elaborated in a footnote, for him, the act-affliction dichotomy relies on a kind of what he calls a Stone Age metaphysics, whose adequacy dissipates once one looks at actual cases. So, in what follows, I want to join together some excerpts from participants from Nev Jones and colleagues' 2016 study of the phenomenology of the onset of psychosis, with excerpts from a 2021 online conference that I co-organized with Patricia, who is on the call, and others at the intersections of psychedelic and mad movements, which is entitled Psychedelics, Madness and Awakening, Harm Reduction and Future Visions. And together, I hope that they might provide some insights into the ways that relational, social, and cultural factors shape the unfurling of willed extreme experiences. So, okay, so there's a few quotes here. So in the first quote, one of Jones et al.'s interviewees, Camilla, emphasizes the importance of the relational and in particular the familial undergirding her drive towards psychosis. She says, when I was 17, I became a lot more interested in schizophrenia and psychosis. And then I found out that my father had extreme psychosis when he was around the same age. From the literature I was reading, I got this idea that I'd be able to understand his experiences a lot better if I actually made myself psychotic. A similar phenomenon is evoked in the PMA conference by prominent US mental health advocate, the social worker Ron Unger. Unger describes his pursuit of his extreme experience as a revolutionary Langian journey out of the oppressive environment he had found himself in when young, and it was sparked by an LSD experience. He says, during that trip, I encountered some beings that let me know that things and experiences didn't have to mean what they had come to mean for me. And if I wanted, I could develop a completely different sense of myself and of the world. Now, a lot of people go through psychedelic trips and they come down and they say, oh, wasn't that fun? But it might not change them that much. But for me, I made it my goal to reorganize my life around the discoveries I'd made on that trip. I do find it interesting that a key theme in psychosis is the loss of a sense of self and the loss of contact with a previous sense of reality. But my sense at the time was of desperately wanting to get rid of my previous sense of self and to get rid of my previous sense of reality because they'd been so oppressive. Later in his talk, Unger suggests that cultural scripts framing extreme experiences as illnesses to be passively subjected to rather than something to actively will can end up being self-fulfilling prophecies. Other conversations at the PMA conference raise similar issues, but at a collective level in relation to analyses of colonialism, patriarchy, and saneism. So in the Q&A of a panel on histories and legacies, Imani Robinson suggested one difference between psychedelic and psychotic experiences is how they're differently positioned in relation to structures of oppression that effectively impose their own will, enabling or disabling one's capacity to consent. So Robinson says, as somebody who's at risk of police violence all the time in my communities, it feels as though there's some uneasiness in thinking about psychosis versus psychedelic experiences, as if we can make them the same or think about them or respond to them in the same way. And I think some of that is about consent, about the very real difference of being diagnosed as psychotic versus consensually exploring psychedelic experiences. This idea of wanting to explore versus being violently responded to. Consensual exploration and the explicit permission to dwell in the uncertainty given in emerging psychedelic integration practices can be contrasted with the urgent need for clarity or certainty, which next Penelope describes as a kind of motor of her madness. Wanting it to be one thing or the other, clearly madness and outside my control, or clearly not madness. It's hard to tell what was going on psychologically, but I kind of felt like, did I kind of just in order for a sense of closure and certainty, try to push myself over the edge? And finally, and unsurprisingly, in a context of rapid medicalization of psychedelics, there's been a clear therapeutic injunction to recuperate all experiences that grows out of this assertion that nothing in the mind can harm you, and related maxims like there's no such thing as a bad trip, only challenging experiences that can be made good or insightful or productive, and so on. So consider how the injunction to figure it all out could shape the it that is being figured out. Jones and colleagues write, the delusions were like a puzzle or a game, said another, that I had to break down. For many participants, it was this active process of interpretation and naming that led particular symptoms to take on clearer and more enduring forms and meanings. Okay, so a couple of points that I just want to draw out from this. First, coming back to Bill Richards, he says of the person undergoing psychedelic therapy, the bottom line with a well-prepared person is to trust one's own mind, one's grounding with the guide beside him or her, the safety of the physical surroundings, and if religious perspectives permit, God or another sacred symbol for ultimate reality. In this context, there really is nothing to fear. It's easy to question such a strong statement, especially given examples of how trust in or curiosity about or openness to one's experience can drive these kind of infinite loops and spirals that seem to undergird like some understandings and approaches to madness. What instead I find compelling in this quote is Richards's focus on the context, a wider network bathed in trust, groundedness, and safety. And so we might want to caveat and just remember that like clinical trials are not always trustworthy. certainly not for certain people, certain demographics. And medical provision is not always trustworthy. But I think it is precisely the trust in a wider context that in turn successfully bears witness to the extreme experience, which enables its consecration. Such an understanding overlaps with the celebrated spaces of soteria houses, mad liberation communities, and the like. Indeed, in the same chapter where he describes the psychedelic demon, Richards himself approvingly cites the soteria house model, a respite space for people experiencing psychosis, which emerged out of ideas and practices developed by Lang and others in the 1960s. Soteria houses are spaces centered upon community and shared witnessing, and Richards mentioning them alongside the practices of psychedelic therapy reminds us of the long-standing weave of learning between psychedelic and mad experiences. So as the late psychedelic researcher Ralph Metzner was fond of saying, subjective plus one equals objective. This then invites a different reading of the relationship between the intentional or willing stances of trustfulness, curiosity, and openness in psychedelic states and the value of integration. We might say that ambiguously psychotomimetic, psychedelic, and more, as per the list of the many names of these unruly substances, these experiences become properly psychedelic through their sharing, being witnessed and explored together. And then as a kind of, the other thing I want to draw out of this is thinking about psychotherapy more broadly, psychedelic psychotherapy. So individualist kind of agency maximization is a standard goal of psychotherapy oriented towards a kind of autonomous liberal subject. Then frameworks, though, that call for subjects to cede control, to embrace and submit, to be curious, to recognize that there's no such thing as a bad trip, in and through, trust, be open, let go, etc. They may be pointing us more to non-liberal cultures of use or forms of life, which is a term that Nicholas Langlitz and Alex Gearin have used recently. Cultures of use where psychedelics may be used to increase submission or loyalty, devotion, or trust in others. And so these non-liberal virtues may actually be a much more natural fit for the kinds of practices that we're kind of cultivating around the use of psychedelics, albeit in psychedelic therapy. So as part of exploring how psychedelic therapy modalities may flourish in contexts where these are celebrated virtues, we might also consider its role in cultivating a set of other practices that are less kind of convenient or easily assimilable to the therapy narrative. High control groups, or this language of the cultic milieu has been used in relation to this more recently in psychedelic discourses. Psychedelic therapy practices emerging amongst culturally diverse populations and non-liberal cultures. And here I'm also thinking about the kind of growing interest in sort of global psychiatry's desire to export these kind of new Western models of psychedelic therapy to kind of around the world. New psychedelic using mystical religions and re-articulations of folie à deux or collective madness. So with this in mind, it's a kind of final question to like leave us with is, as psychedelic medicalization and mainstreaming continues apace, should we want to parochialize increased agency as psychedelic therapy's ultimate goal? Or, you know, what else? It's a kind of what else question. Okay, so that's it, really. Yeah, thanks. So there was quite a lot there, you know. But in terms of talking about these kinds of topics, or else before talking about kind of more participatory modes of engagement, I guess they're quite separate, so we can just see how things go. But yeah, I'd love to chat and get your feedback as well, you know, kind of trying to think through these ideas for, yeah. Yeah. So should I just, can I just?
Want to do it?
Yeah, happy to, yeah.
Did autonomy come up as a sort of beneficial part of any sort of healing process? And you know, sort of homeostasis or any biological markers alongside that?
Well, I'd, I mean, I don't really do the kind of biological side of things, but in terms of autonomy, I mean, I totally think the way in which psychotherapy broadly is being like developed in different modalities, often autonomy is really central to it, you know? But I think that's really just like because autonomy is really central to psychotherapy in general. It's like the goal of sort of psychotherapy. So psychedelic forms of psychotherapy are trying to kind of fit in some ways into that model. But I'm not sure it's kind of so simple because of the kind of particular kinds of practices of submission that are, you know, so like coveted at the center of like psychedelic healing. So I guess that's kind of what I was trying to draw out. But I think in general, the idea of like autonomy is really important, or is a goal of psychotherapy. Yeah, I think that extends to psychedelic psychotherapy.
There's a right-wing psychedelic philosopher,
right?
A lot.
Yeah.
Another time.
Yeah. What do you know the name?
But younger, Forrest Back.
Younger. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's so these like right-wing psychedelic use is kind of maybe includes a lot of different kind of case studies that could be interesting for thinking through kind of modes of dependency that are being created and loyalty and these kinds of, which in other places, but it's not to kind of also kind of denigrate them as virtues, you know. I think they're also like really beautiful. Yeah, but they're really beautiful virtues as well, you know, like and in some ways I think like we should be thinking more about them, but they're sort of risky in a way. Oh, this, yeah. Did you, Ernest?
Yeah, I was thinking that most of this stuff actually comes from non-liberal traditions, right? So the way in which you would use, I don't know, psychedelics in the highlands of Mexico by indigenous people is by going through the purgatory, through the process of torment, which of course is sanitized and out of the scope of the Western medical practice.
Right.
So when you were posing this question, I guess it's because this has been kind of colonized by the sort of Western idea of what is therapy and what is medicine. But also very particularly control obsessed space, actually torment and like surrendering your will to the bruja, right? Exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah.
So I guess in a way that the global north experiences the anomaly rather than the norm.
Yeah.
This liberal kind of input is what we're trying to do with this.
Yeah, I think that fits the yeah, the kind of the thrust of the argument in terms of trying to kind of make strange or particular the kind of the modality that's kind of being developed here in relation to a wider kind of backdrop. But it does raise also then interesting questions for those of us who are interested in them about continuity and discontinuity as these kind of traditions are adapted and brought into something that's more like psychiatric, the psychiatric toolbox, you know, like to what extent are they different or not? For example, the person, like, for example, one example being the idea that the person who has the person who's in need of healing is the one who takes the psychedelics. And that's not always the case, right? In kind of some indigenous traditions in which it's not the person who needs healing who takes the psychedelic. So where are the cuts, you know, as it were, and where are the continuities over time? It does kind of raise that question. But either way, yeah, I think, yeah, it's if you think about if we fast forward 10 years, where will the kinds of modalities of healing that have been cultivated in the crucible of psychedelic therapy in these Western research contexts, where will they most be flourishing? Then I'm not sure it will be in psychotherapy, you know, clinics where people are trying to become more autonomous versions of themselves. And that's the sort of question that gets raised. Yeah. Should I keep going around? Or would you?
There's one online. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Mike says, Tehseen, I have to let you know this talk was deeply inspiring and healing for me, as I've experienced a lot of the symbols and schematics you speak of in psychedelics / lucid dreams / somatic work / trance states. Do you think just about approaching the demon, is this about approaching and surrendering to your fears of a new state you're experiencing? Yeah, I think something that Patricia and I talked about, or I think I've really learned from Patricia in the wake of our Psychedelics, Madness and Awakening conferences, how much of madness is about the experience of madness and context of madness is about fear and fear of madness, you know, and this kind of sort of spiraling kind of thing. Hope I'm not like misrepresenting Patricia. But yeah, I think in terms of the therapeutic modality, well, not in terms of the therapeutic modality, I think myself, I absolutely think that a lot of the surrendering is, yeah, it's about surrendering to what? And is what you're surrendering to a fear of something or something? I mean, I don't really know, but I think, but I think fear is very prevalent in these states, and in some ways, it's kind of like an accelerant because of the way in which the fear of the thing can make the thing bigger, you know. But thank
Yeah, thank you so much for that talk. I was kind of trying to corner you before you started talking even about the possible crossovers with the history of sorcery and ritual magic, where you are actually attempting to deliberately conjure a specific demon and often master them, and sort of the opposite of surrender. And I'm wondering if
parallels can be drawn to either modern Western psychedelic therapies where you might
into that space with a very strong intention to find and address a particular issue that happened, or uses of psychedelic medicine where you might use them with the intention again of finding and addressing a particular spirit or demon with a very strong assertion of your will and not a surrender. Or is that not a possible? Is that not even possible with psychedelics?
with psychedelics.
Yeah.
So there's I hope I didn't mute the folks online. Can you still hear? Because I muted this.
If you want to put yours, then I will unmute this one.
We're still here.
Oh yeah. Can you still? We can hear. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, we hear fine.
Yeah, there's a nice chapter. This maybe gets at some of this, but I don't really know these histories, and I'd really love to like talk more conversation. It's super interesting. There's a nice chapter by Oliver Davis in Handbook on Autonomy or something, and he's developing this concept of auto-heteronomy, and so talking about the difference between heteronomy and autonomy in the psychotherapy context, and autonomy is kind of coming from yourself, and heteronomy is like from the outside, and ways in which psychotherapists are often trained so that they can resist the urge to provide the insight that the person is not ready for because they've not had themselves. So there's kind of this tension, and so he kind of articulates this idea of all the stuff around preparation and forming an intention and so on before a psychedelic experience, and getting instructions on facing the demon and so on, and really kind of internalizing that. That's this kind of heteronymous kind of moment, but then it leads you to, yeah, exactly that moment of sort of, I guess he just sort of describes it in terms of sort of ego death or whatnot, in which there's a kind of something big kind of happens, and one can ask where that sort of comes from, but even if it comes from the different parts of oneself, I guess there's a kind of, you could say that's kind of heteronymous, but ultimately if it's coming from the self, you can see it's kind of autonomous. So for him, the big doses of psychedelic therapy can be understood in terms of auto-heteronomy in that sense. And that's, for him, something that really complicates the discussions in the psychedelic space right now around consent, and around this idea of like, oh, we must not at all influence, versus, an overbearing amount of kind of attempted influence on other people, and this idea of kind of concerns around control and a lack of ability to consent there. Yeah, so I don't know if that's helpful, but
so you'd say the will can only take you so far, and then you necessarily always reach a point of the need to surrender, sort of.
Yeah, it's the limit point of willing. And something happens there, and that's, I suppose, this sort of something explosive or reactive, right? To use that more psychoanalytical kind of language, something comes out, and that is potentially the space of healing, or certainly of insight or breakthrough, that kind of thing. Yeah, I'd be super interested to hear how that might relate back to the context you're talking about.
How much do you think the voices and approaches of traditional cultures who use these practices are represented in this discussion? Like how, I know we've got our psychedelic psychotherapeutic model, but like, have there been any discussions with practitioners who've been working with this for years and years and who like the Shipibo culture traditions, how they would suggest people work with the medicine?
You mean in the development of this modality?
Yeah, just with the like discussing about surrendering and like how you use will and all of that, because we've also got quite an individualized approach in our psychotherapy. But when you're in ceremonial settings or using plant medicines, there's a vocabulary that's more inclusive of more than just your will.
Yeah.
Like you're meeting with plants, you're meeting with spirits. And I wonder if there's like distinction between surrendering and witnessing. And like, I don't know, there's just kind of a nuance that maybe isn't picked up in our psychotherapeutic model that encompasses more than just the individual and the psychotherapist, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I definitely think the psychotherapy model is really impoverished with its kind of basically, well, at least, and this is possibly a bit of a caricature of it, what I've been presenting, but this thing about willed versus unwilled, you know, it's like it's one like binary. What did you said, willed versus and witnessing? Could you say a bit more about that? Super interesting.
Yeah, like surrender and witnessing, I think. Because so I was with a Shipibo group for a few months earlier this year. And the way that the maestro would speak to us, it wouldn't be like, you don't want to surrender to say it's like a force of fear or an energy of fear. It was more about like noticing your core, witnessing, being strong, connecting with the plants. So it's like, it was a surrendering to the greater intelligence of Mother Ayahuasca or the plants, but it wasn't a surrendering into these energies that could be potentially destructive. So it was actually like you center yourself, you witness, you hold strong, but you don't surrender your agency. And, you know, it's witnessing versus surrender, I guess, is the kind of nuance.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really interesting. Don't know. I mean, there are probably people, well, there are lots of people in the room who are more experienced than me. And when you, in the psychotherapeutic model that's like developed through the kind of research centers and stuff, the moment at which something comes, I mean, I think about it in relation to holotropic breath work as well. And like when something comes up, that kind of bearing witness kind of makes sense to me. I guess it may be, and this is helpful for me in thinking it may be useful to further situate, because I don't know if you noticed, but like I'm drawing on like Bill Richards and the Hopkins crowd and stuff. And they have this like particular proclivity around the kind of mystical experience, right? In this moment of utter kind of ego loss, which I think does seem to me to be inconsistent with the idea of bearing witness, because there's no one to bear witness, as it were. So I kind of almost didn't want to like pick on that lab too much, but maybe I should pick on them a bit more. But it's it's really interesting thinking, and then it sort of maybe harkens back to the point about how at least that form of modality as it's developing is situated actually in a much wider like ecology of enriched practices that it could learn a lot from. I think that's great. Yeah, thanks for that. We at the back and then sorry.
I just have a question around the use of the term healing. Obviously, it's been used a lot in this talk, and it seems to have adopted like lots of different definitions depending on like who's talking about it and how. It can be a really like individual process, or it can be very collective, as we've been talking about. Have you ever seen people go through this process and reject the idea of healing? And if so, what does that look like?
I mean, the thing that comes to mind for me from just kind of my involvement in the space and I guess interviewing with folks and that sort of thing and just being in it myself is that, and something that I'm quite drawn to is, and I guess you could say this is a form of healing, but or else it's actually a rejection in the service of something more like politicization. And instead of some fully understood form of healing, it's about kind of making change in the world. So that's what comes to mind in terms of what's not healing or what healing becomes. Did you have something in mind?
Not especially. I mean, a few different things. I mean, yes, I mean, healing can be changing your environment, and sort of accepting the environment, or it can be accepting. I mean, it's such a tricky term because it's so subjective. So it's quite difficult to even define what rejecting healing would be.
Yeah.
That's why I was asking what you see it to have looked like.
Yeah, I find healing, I mean, I actually find it quite a useful term, quite an expansive term that I like contrasting with like therapy. And so for me, one of the more interesting like operative distinctions between individual healing and collective healing, and then thinking about, well, what does it mean when we're talking about like collective healing, and what could collective healing in the context of like the greater normalization and like use of psychedelics and kind of culture look like? So yeah, that's something that we tried to think a little bit about. And also its relationship, perhaps coming back to the kind of mad movements as well, and movements in which extreme experiences have been so stigmatized and feared and pathologized and so on. So what scope is there? We were just touching on this before, for the kind of increased availability and literacy around psychedelic experiences to kind of reduce or combat stigma around extreme experiences not produced through psychedelics. That's a kind of open question, but increasingly with the kind of politics of medicalization, there's a kind of demarcation of the good extreme experience, like the psychedelic experience in the clinic, from the bad extreme experience that is pathologized or the residue or whatever. And as that happens more and more, then, you know, there's a kind of advantage to putting these sets of experiences closer together in terms of how they might influence one another, in terms of something like collective healing or collective liberation, maybe. But the more we separate them, then they're just like, well, what's this got to do with that? This is about my individual healing project or whatever. That's a bit of a caricature, but you know, yeah. Thanks for that question. Thanks.
Oh yeah, it's
Sorry.
kind of a bit of an extension. Sorry, a bit of an extension actually of what you're saying, which is really the kind of different narratives and the sort of construction around madness and like therapy, specifically with psychedelics. I worked in an inpatient adolescent unit many years ago, and when the young people were admitted in a kind of active state of psychosis, as a psychologist, we were like not supposed to work with them because that's a problematic narrative, and that's totally different and such a sort of kind of discourse about resistance and resisting this experience and kind of getting back to whatever normalcy is supposed to be. Very different from sort of jumping into the mouth of the dragon. So yeah, I just wondered if you have a bit more to sort of say about that, really, because it seems like they are very polarized.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just a really interesting direction to sort of see how they could merge, particularly when you take into account also sort of different cultures, positions around what madness and normalcy is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess I know a little bit about the sort of relatively recent history of the two sets of experiences in an Anglo kind of American context. And there, something that we were touching on before was like there was a kind of much closer braiding of psychedelic and mad experiences in the 60s, sort of waned in a way, and now it may be something that's sort of we're seeing a bit more of again. And in the 70s, these soteria houses that I mentioned, there was this kind of idea at the time of the people running them as respites for people in kind of extreme states, that they should be staffed not by mental health professionals because then they have a lot to unlearn, you know, but rather by people who have tripped and been with people who are tripping, you know. So it's this kind of sense of like a transferability of sort of knowledges, but that sense of a transferability of knowledges is kind of ebbs and flows, I think, historically, you know. And so, yeah, so that's one thing. Oh yeah. Okay, should we go? Do you want to?
Yeah, that was actually very closely related to my question. So I was going to ask, to what extent do you think madness, psychosis, schizophrenia are malleable across time and space? So whether that's cultures, but also time. So if we say that there's this psychedelic renaissance or these more acceptance of altered states and so on, then doesn't that change the collective consciousness such that there becomes a new norm? And then doesn't that change the nature of madness?
Mm.
And so would one person in one culture who's considered normal be considered mad in another, vice versa? And also in time, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's been alluded to in various forms. So I don't know if I'm just repeating something that's already been.
Yeah, as like psychedelic / psychotomimetic kind of experiences become more and more normalized, then what is the new madness? I mean, it's a kind of, you know, an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, the kind of this model of madness that I was drawing on from Louis Sas, that's, I think he's interested in kind of people within like modernity, hence the sort of madness and modernism thing. Yeah, so that's kind of maybe a slightly more restricted version of madness that's being articulated around these like hyper reflexivity and these loops of like thinking about thinking, you know, as a kind of driver of psychosis. So I don't know that that would necessarily extend kind of beyond that kind of, you know, limited period, but he and people who theorize in that vein think about it like it's a kind of, from Immanuel Kant through to, I think Foucault describing Kant calls modern man or modern, you know, people in modernity as empirico-transcendental doublets, like at the same time completely afflicted by the forces of the world, you know, completely willed, you know, like in that sense of willed, like just nothing compared to the bigger forces of the cosmos. And at the same time as that, constructing everything around us, you know, that kind of Kantian sense of like, you know, we have the spatio-temporal goggles or whatever, like, so we create the entire universe. So we're both completely powerless and completely powerful. And that's the sort of paradox of modernity. And madness is sort of ratcheting that right up, you know, really recognizing that. And kind of that's the sort of, that's the space of madness. So I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about in relation to the sort of the last point is about non-liberal cultures of use, is in that, like, what does it mean? Because you could say, of course, like this is where I think psychedelic bioethicists tend to go at the moment. They're like, yeah, okay, yeah, there can be these kind of cultures of use in which we're very, like, there's a lot of like dependency and the consent stuff is kind of questionable or whatever, but at least we can consent to getting into those spaces, you know. And so it's almost that, you know, like you want to join this kind of this psychedelic kind of commune here, or this space that's using psychedelics, and it's like a, you know, it's organized in this kind of very, you could say, around these kind of, around devotion to a particular person or an idea or whatever. Well, that's okay, but you need to choose. Like, as long as you get to choose first, like, I'm going to go there, I'm going to go there, then there's a kind of freedom at the heart of the project of who you want to become, even if it's a very kind of dependent kind of figure or something like that. And I think maybe one of the insights that's quite nice from this approach of to madness is to say, well, what would it mean to not try and start from the ground, but to live better in the paradox of being always willed and willing, you know, which is in a way a kind of insight of the madness of the modern period, I think, from Sas anyway. So that's kind of something that's kind of interesting. Like, what does it mean to be with paradox rather than find the kind of originary ground of freedom, which is like a classic liberal project, but it's a liberal fabulation in a way. It's a kind of fiction, you know. Well, potentially. Yeah. Do we want to go here?
Yeah, to Benjamin. Do you want to ask your question? Thanks for being patient.
Hi, Tehseen. Great to see you again. Can anyone hear me? No. Hello?
Here. Here.
Just working on it.
Hello? Hello, hello?
Find out.
Hello? Tehseen? No? Hi? Hello? Hi, Tehseen. Yes? Okay, great. Great to see you, and thanks a lot for this presentation, and also for the Psychedelics Madism Awakening conference 2 years ago. So I have a question for you about will and informed consent in the relation to psychedelics and psychosis. So there's a context, so I'll explain that. I'm designing a protocol for a clinical trial of a customized ayahuasca ceremony to treat bipolar disorder. The problem is that bipolar people have increased vulnerability to manic and psychotic reactions to ayahuasca and other psychedelics. But the qualitative data in my PhD shows that bipolar people can have overall benefits in the long term, even if they have adverse reactions in the ceremony. Therefore, I'm trying to write an informed consent document, which includes the likelihood of a bipolar person becoming manic and or psychotic during the clinical trial. And I'd like your advice and some theoretical framework in terms of will, consent, all the things, your themes from today, to help write this document, please.
Oh, golly. So just literally sound while I think. Is that good? Oh, maybe I'll show me. Does that help? Can you still hear me? Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think I don't know if those would be the right kind of excerpts, you know, in terms of people themselves working through kind of different variations of willing or being unable to will to be able to shape the experiences that they're going through, but maybe a kind of compilation of different kinds of stories of people trying to consent amidst framings of because it's the other thing is like people come into like psychedelic trials, as with anything, I guess, with like expectations, but with psychedelic trials, it'd be quite strong expectations. And I guess depending on how people think the healing may be taking place or the concerns that they may have, that may bring certain kind of possibilities more to the fore in terms of what may actually then kind of manifest in terms of how things unfold for them. So I generally, just as a qualitative researcher, like the idea of lots of vignettes as kind of being useful. But I guess it makes me think about two literatures where these conversations are being had. One is around like the transformative psychedelic experiences literature, and you know that this stuff about a fundamental limit to what can be conveyed about an experience that you can not only know in advance, but also can reshape the very values with which you would determine whether you would have wanted it in advance or not. And then the other thing is, well, advanced directives in the mental health space, right? And the kind of, not necessarily advanced directives as a tool, but like the discourse around that. So I guess I'd be curious about what are the kind of good conversations that are happening in those spaces, but in general, beyond like vignettes, super interested to think about it with you a bit more, but it also, hands have just gone up in the room, so they may actually be suggestions for you. Let's keep this one going. Did anyone have direct suggestions?
Well, I just had a thought of the matter. I mean, because if you're going to rule people out of psychedelic therapy for having bipolar disorder, you needed, I would have thought, make a strong case for there being an increased risk of an episode from bipolar disorder compared to another mental disorder, right? So you have to be able to say that people who have depression who do psychedelic therapy are at less risk of an episode compared to bipolar disorder. I don't know that literature, but I think there's a lot of fear around there's too much fear basically around if your diagnosis constitutes any sort of form of psychosis, then everybody's really scared of it. But I think I disagree with that, because going back to what you were saying earlier on about if fear is at the core of psychosis, and I think I agree with that. And you look at the emotional spectrum of psychedelic experiences, they're very broad. So on some level, I'm like, well, if fear is at the core of psychosis and you've got a substance which induces a phenomenological state quite similar to that, but it's got positive or blissful mood states, I mean, that's a therapeutic window in my book, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, thanks for that. Did you hear that, Benjamin? Yeah, we'll keep it going. I think there's more as well, maybe. Peter, thank you.
It's not in response to this, more general question. I want to return to Kant that you mentioned. How do you define will exactly? Like, for example, in relation to free will, and that in relation to consent?
Well, it's not really my game. So instead, in a more kind of ethnographic vein, I'm definitely interested in putting like what I assume to be kind of like flavors of willing side by side, like trusting, being curious about. Those are kind of different, you know, in themselves. Being open to, and maybe kind of at the end of the day, getting at something like a definition, but it's not today. What do you think?
Well, I'm just thinking there's one kind of general strong definition you get in Schopenhauer, who's Kantian. There's a difference between, you know, will as a desire, curiosity, as you say, but then there's, you know, free will is quite different from that because it means that you are in control of yourself, as it were. And that's a highly disputed topic, of course. And so, you know, a lot of people don't believe in free will at all, which means you can't really give consent. And there's no real opposition between willed and unwilled psychosis in that case, because your will itself is determined by prior mental states or prior physical states or others or whatever. It's quite an important distinction, right? I mean, for the ethical ramifications.
Yeah, totally. And like, I mean, this is where I like with the kind of, at least this conceptualizing of kind of this like empirical transcendental doublet, this kind of, you know, the willed, willing kind of circle points us to. It's like, it's exactly that. I mean, like, yeah, okay, it's a moment where I just made a choice, but you also just offered me the choices, or you framed it in a certain, like, am I being subjected to, or am I choosing, or is it always both? And the challenge is not to try and find safe harbor in like, oh, phew, yeah, I did choose that, or at least I chose the thing 3 years ago that then through a whole series of like, you know, avenues has led me to where I am now. But because I chose it 3 years ago, I'm somehow, you know, I consented fully. But instead, like, you're always in the middle. So yeah, I mean, I think I sort of, you know, I'm into that idea that of beginning by rejecting kind of free will as particularly useful, whereas I think the ethicists are very committed to the idea of like finding the moments in which there was freedom or a choice, you know, a genuine choice, as they might say.
Yeah, well, it's deep question that we've looked at for 3,000 years, so still not there. But...
Yeah. So I get, and I guess sort of like more ethnographically, I'm quite into the idea of finding ways to stay with the, you know, the paradox rather than the urge to ground. Yeah, and so maybe it's that's sort of something to bring out in this kind of talk, you know, or this way I think it's like it's the urge to ground, kind of like the urges around escaping the fear that are kind of quite central. Yeah, thanks. Did you want to go right on that?
Yeah, I was thinking about, if you want to go first.
No,
I was thinking about intersubjectivity here, right? Because we're going to the old fakes, like very kind of like Freudian ideas of ego dissolution. Again, that's why I'm saying maybe the Western model is the anomaly, right? Because that language doesn't exist. People in Mexico, Colombia are looking for transmutation, not even surrender or witnessing. That's maybe one of the many indigenous traditions, which they're plural as well. But the fact that we are going through this notion of ego and then dissolution, that only speaks back to these debates that have no meaning outside of this philosophical tradition, right? 3,000 years of, subjectivity, or then we have these guys that have told us about intersubjectivity, right? Why do we go and stick with these more fixed notions of self and other and mind and body? Why do you think that's the case? Is this because they need to sanitize and make it pure for the therapeutic world? Or is it because they don't have any other grammars? Or they have been, it's just this colonial project in which, we discovered these things and these other 2,000 years of tradition somewhere else that is not Europe and the US don't matter. What do you think is going on here?
Yeah. I share your righteous indignation. Yeah.
But that was a question. Yeah. It's a question for you. Like, what do you think of
what is going on?
Yeah, my answer was like, yeah. I mean, what do I think is going on?
Can I add something?
Oh, yeah.
Like, to conceptualize a completely different paradigm is pretty hard done, right? Like until you experience something, even looking at religion, like how we took God away from people experiencing it and it became like a taught, you know, I'll tell you, the priest will tell you how to connect with God. You know, and these compounds, these plants allow you to experience, right? If that makes any sense to that connection.
No,
But
of course.
if you're then experiencing something versus considering it and thinking about it, it's a very different, you can't, I don't know, just put yourself into that without experiencing it.
Well-
Surely, because you can't just conceptualize something that's beyond your own paradigm of understanding.
The missionaries did when they found this in the colonial space in the 16th century with indigenous Mexicans. Immediately they spotted that. They wanted to get rid of psychedelics because they allow these guys to speak directly with God. They don't need the priest. So they didn't experience psychedelics, but they knew immediately what was going on. And that's why they forbid the use of psychedelics. So maybe, I mean, that's another critique I have of the psychedelic world. We have this fixation with firsthand experience. But ethnographically, we don't need it. I mean, the shamans might be the ones taking the psychedelics and no one else is in the room is taking them, or the other way around. I guess it's just in this therapeutic world, the experience we want to control and sanitize it in certain ways. But that was my question. Why this obsession? Why we cannot think about any other paradigms, even though they are there, available?
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm with you. And like I think I said somewhere in the talk, you know, there are so many resources for being able to think beyond the kind of contained, protected, liberal mind in which nothing can harm us. But the ones that I kind of want to try and bring to bear are from the kind of mad movements and traditions of the last, you know, whatever, 60, 70 years or more. But that's kind of what I'm drawing on. I guess part of the reason for that is partly it's biographical and my own history and kind of mad movements before getting into the sort of psychedelic space. But it's also just to kind of open out many fronts of critique. So yeah, I mean, we could totally have a conversation like when we should be having conversations, and honestly, braiding them together is something that is something I should probably be doing more of, but we should be having conversations, of course, about like long colonial histories and what's, you know, going on here in terms of control and the muting of the world and the kind of the arising of a single binary of me versus not me or whatever. But yeah, I guess maybe I'm trying to get a similar thing. I don't know, but it's using resources from kind of mad pride and theorizing kind of madness and phenomenological psychiatry. But obviously psychiatry itself is this kind of long and colonial kind of history. So maybe we'll all meet at the top of the mountain. Andy?
I'm curious about the Hopkins model and what they think will happen if you don't face your demons. And is that in itself a kind of fear of madness? That actually, if you don't face your demons, madness is the main attractor. And there's this sort of narrow point where you're not going to go mad. Is that what they're saying? Or what will happen if you don't face your demons in the way prescribed?
Yeah.
I'm curious about their demonology.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good one. Yeah, I like that way of putting it. Yeah, not just kind of a missed opportunity for healing, but, well, and then I guess this can get articulated in the re-traumatization, kind of in the framing of re-traumatization or yeah. I see the occasional paper that points at like psychedelics as traumatogens kind of thing, as well as being, you know, mind manifesting or healing or whatever. It's good. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really interesting question. Maybe we could bring that back to the Hopkins folks and see what they think. Because I wonder also, I mean, Bill Richards is influenced a lot by Paul Tillich and these kind of theologians, and is a theologian.
I was going to say, is it a Christian legacy, a legacy of Christian thought about demons?
Right. Yeah. Can we talk about them?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, so a few of the points that you made kind of made me reflect on the overlap with this study I mentioned earlier, navigating groundlessness, and looking at, so we interviewed people that had ontologically challenging psychedelic experiences, so they really struggled with the meaning-making process afterwards, sometimes becoming quite obsessively preoccupied with making sense of the experience. They were very disconnected from their body, so disembodied, and they were like desperately trying to get back. Quite a lot of them described their experience as traumatic. And what helped them, almost all participants mentioned some form of grounding, something of what you were saying earlier about the urge to ground. And do you think that the commonality there is that people are having experiences that unground them from normality? And so the grounding that they described was both embodied, so physical exercise or different ones like expression with their body, as well as social and cognitive normalization, so finding a framing that normalizes the experience, as well as a social environment where that experience is normalized within. So do you see the parallels there, or that the fundamental part there is the lack of grounding? I just want to hear a bit more about that urge to ground that you mentioned.
Yeah, maybe. And in the sort of more like spiritual emergency literature, the sort of that's so operative, isn't it? That kind of notion of like being ungrounded and then the need to ground. So it's there in that kind of vocabulary. In terms of the different examples, yeah, I mean, I guess, but I also maybe think about like some of those examples as being where the very nature of the experience and how it unfolded is shaped in certain ways, just because of how someone is sort of emplaced in the world, which I wouldn't immediately think of in terms of a question of grounding. But maybe that is a good meta like vocabulary, you know, in terms of grounding.
Symbolic.
I don't know how that would play out outside of, again, like speaking to like wider contexts and non-Western contexts and so on.
It's just a couple of questions, and then I think we'll have to finish to go to the book.
Yeah.
Patricia, your collaborator, Patricia there.
So Patricia
just talking about the other.
Says, how is the community collaboration that you described at the beginning shaping your understanding and stakes of the questions in your talk? Yeah. Yeah, it kind of feels like two worlds at the moment, without kind of much chance for reflecting and integrating. Yeah, and I think that says something to me. Like, I think I was kind of really invested in this kind of stuff, and I don't know if it's because I've moved away and like a lot of what let me think. A lot of what I'm really invested in right now, and I feel like I've been learning as well, is about relationship building. It's about the centrality of relationships. And so some of that kind of maybe comes through in some of this. It'd be nice to think about that more. It's also about how you can't create knowledge without having relationships, or without it shaping relationships, like the kind of coextensiveness of knowing and knowing as a kind of epistemic modality of healing and ongoing relationships. I don't know where to look. I'm going to look at you. So that sort of relationship building aspect is really interesting. Yeah. So I guess in terms of thinking about collaboration, I can think about what that means in relation to the work with sort of mad communities, for example, and bringing them and psychedelic communities kind of into encounter with one another. Like, how can one do that well? And how can one do that in a way that stays within paradox, maybe? So that's kind of, maybe that's something I've been mulling on a little bit. Thanks for that question. And following the point about post-colonial reflexivity, can you expand a bit on your work in Aotearoa and how may collaboration with Indigenous peoples and cultures be informing your research? Okay, not hugely Yeah, I'll say something actually, which I've been sort of musing on a little bit, which is in terms of drawing resources from sort of MAD studies and these kind of these discourses. The same MAD studies scholar Nev Jones, who I really admire and is wonderful and should read her work. She, if you haven't, she quite recently articulated this idea of epistemic sacrifice, which I thought was really amazing, and it works really in really interesting ways in the context in which I'm working in Aotearoa. But it's kind of like from the voice of the mad, or the person who has been pathologized or identifies as mad or having been mad. She articulates a kind of frustration with how even phenomenological psychiatrists and researchers who want to give voice and do use like qualitative excerpts and so on for people who have kind of been there, still end up using people as data rather than treating them as co-inquirers in their own mind. So she talks about how the phenomenological psychiatrist, and this is, she's had, I believe there's been conversations between her and Louis Sass and as well about this. The phenomenological psychiatrist and the researcher needs to get out of the way. And this is not a notion of sacrifice in the sort of often like anthropological register of something that initiates a process of reciprocity and relationship, but it's a notion of sacrifice that's more radical, and it's about loss, just the sheer loss. Like, so it's speaking to kind of relations of power and needing to kind of step out of the way in order for the sort of, for her and people like her to be able to speak and take the mic, as it were. So I've been thinking about that actually. So to your point, Blake, thank you for the question in relation to working with Māori, for example, in Aotearoa. It's a really interesting set or tricky set of challenges to be in some kind of relationship with Māori who are doing psychedelic stuff and have their own knowledge traditions as well. Kaupapa Māori research is a kind of big thing that has been flourishing since the 1970s of like research by Māori, for Māori, and so on, with its own epistemologies and foundational texts that internationally are cited all the time in terms of like decolonizing methodologies and so on. So if you are in relationship with these traditions and Māori, then what is your role as a knowledge producer? And I sort of, in that sense, see myself as somewhat analogous to the role of the phenomenological psychiatrist who is critiqued in this kind of mad studies context. So yeah, maybe there's something paradoxical about that, the epistemic sacrifice of the person who is in the business of making knowledge. I'll leave that there, yeah. But thank you.
I think, thanks again.